Okay, we're resuming today. It's the 5th of July, and we're resuming on the subject of the criteria that will, as I see it, apply at the judgment seat. Some of the things that we'll be judged on as believers at the judgment seat. So criterion number 13. It seems to me that Jesus will judge us on the level of our generosity and how sacrificially we gave our money away. Now, again, let's just remind people, we're not talking about becoming saved because you gave your money away. We're not talking about donating money to have a cathedral window built so that you can be saved. We're not talking about that. We're talking about what you do after you have been justified. So we're not speaking of giving so that you can be saved, the sort of thing that sparked the Reformation, with Martin Luther responding to people asking for donations for that very purpose, to get people out of purgatory. That's not what we're talking about. We're speaking of generosity as a way of life and as a character quality. And the Bible says a lot about money because money is important, because it represents and embodies value, and it's a perfect means of exchange. You can change it for all sorts of other things, and giving it away is the very opposite of what our flesh wants. It's a very good measure of where you're at in your flesh, because your flesh nature wants to hold on to your money very, very much, and a person's spirit is willing to give it away. And whether you give it away or keep it is a pretty close indicator of where you're at spiritually, how generous you are or how mean you are. Pretty close measure. And also there's a very high correlation between meanness with money and general all-round wickedness. I've personally found in my observations that people who are mean with money are, generally speaking, pretty nasty in other ways as well. It goes together like a horse and carriage. So, which is why the Bible also says that the love of money is a root of all kinds of evil. It's because money is a kind of proxy for what the flesh is about, an indicator of what the flesh is about. So God wants us to have a generous heart. He wants us to give. He wants us to develop a generous heart. And that emphasis needs to be on the word develop, because you can't become generous other than by dealing with your flesh nature, which brings us on to questions of what is the flesh and how do we deal with it. Well, you can't become generous unless you become in such a place that your spirit, your new man, your new nature, is prevailing over your old nature, your flesh, your old man. That's the point. So that's why you need to develop a generous heart, because you don't just get born with one. You have to develop one. And the more you give, the more your heart will become generous. It's something you get by doing it, like a muscle. You get strong muscles by doing things. You don't just, no one gets born Mr. Universe, do you? You don't get born at the hospital and there you are sort of posing like this in the baby photos. It doesn't happen like that. So you develop by doing, and it's exactly the same with money. So, but also I'm just going to paraphrase the parable of the rich fool. You'll all know this, about the man who comes to Jesus, and he begins by asking Jesus to divide the inheritance between his brother and him. And Jesus says that a man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. And he speaks about the parable of the rich fool, who says he's going to tear down his barns and build larger ones and have goods laid up for many years, on page 77. And the man says to him, God says to him, "Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be?" And Jesus goes on in the parable. And he ends by saying, "Instead, seek his kingdom, and these things will be added to you." And he's speaking about the things that we're not to worry about. Effectively, what our possessions and money, and whether we'll have enough to eat, enough to live, and enough to do things. And that's an interesting point. These things will be added to you if you seek his kingdom. And so a lot of people focus on the first part of that verse, seek his kingdom. and then kind of forget the second part of the verse, which says these things will be added to you. And I take that entirely literally. And I think that if we focus on his kingdom and on the next life, these things will be added to us, not only in this life, but in the next life. And we're meant to take it that way. Because in this next passage, which I shall refer to, from Luke, Jesus is even more explicit about it. And so we're told to sell our possessions and give to the poor. And Jesus indicates that the giving away of our money and possessions will lead to us having treasure in heaven. And he even goes as far as to say that we'll have money bags that do not grow old. Now you could say, well, what's he talking about? Is he being metaphorical, entirely metaphorical? Or is he being literal? Well, you can have your own views on that. I personally think he's being literal. That a person gives away in this life, they get back in the next. But I mentioned this before, whether it's literal or metaphorical, whatever it is that we get in the next life that he describes here as money bags or treasure, we'll consider it to have high value, whatever it might be. So it could be, imagine you showed a man from the 12th century a share certificate. He would look at it and think, what's that? But if a man from the 20th century looked at it, he'd be highly impressed. Do you see? So there may be things that will be given in the new world that to us now don't seem to mean anything, but then will be of high value. So whatever it is that the treasure is, you'll consider it to be of high value and worthy of the word treasure. So we needn't even form a conclusion as to whether it's literal. I think it's literal. But if it isn't, it's something which is worthy of the word. Do you see? So, therefore, to be taken seriously. And we're meant to give generously. Now, the Bible doesn't define what generous is. And we need to be wary of people telling us that we're supposed to tithe or give so much or this percentage or that. That's not what we're to do. We're to give generously. So you're to decide what give generously means. And I remember once tackling some church leaders. I was in a church many, many years ago. And it was in the early days when I was running a business. And these people, this couple of church leaders, said to me that they wanted me to give them 10% of the profits of my business. And I said, really? And I said, where did you get the idea from that I should do that? And they said, well, that's what the Bible said. I said, really? Where does the Bible say this? Where does the Bible say I should give you 10% of anything? And anyway, I pinned them down. So it was a mistake to tackle me on something, because I pinned them down and said, provide me with your authority for saying that. And they couldn't. And in the end, this church leader, he said to me, he admitted that he had no basis for what he was saying at all. And he said, yes, but if we didn't teach that, how would the church get money? Now, do you see? Now, that's a separate point. A willingness that people have to say false things to build their own kingdom, or even if it was to build God's kingdom. They're saying something false to build even God's kingdom. I don't think they necessarily were building God's kingdom. They're building their own kingdom, but be that as it may, whatever they were building, they were knowingly saying something false in order to achieve their objective. But that's by the by. The point is, the Bible doesn't tell us a specific percentage to give, to be generous. It doesn't do that. It's actually much harder than that. We're simply to be generous. Now you've got to figure out what being generous is, and it's different for every one of you. And it's actually a much harder thing to be generous than to give a particular percentage. But at any rate, whatever being generous is for you to work out in conjunction with God's guiding and the scripture and your own experience and your own conscience. You've got to figure that out. What's generous mean? And so we've got to learn how to be it. We've got to start asking God, what is it? What does that mean for me? And we need to take seriously the need to build treasure in heaven. I take that totally seriously. And I don't know how much treasure I've got. That's neither here nor there. How much I've actually achieved isn't the issue. The issue is that I want to achieve. So I go out of my way to tell people that, because I want to try to help other people not to be ashamed of thinking and saying that. It actually helps if you say things that are taboo, because that's a taboo issue. So the idea is that Christians are not meant to be seeking for treasure. Well, we're not meant to be seeking for treasure in this world, but we're expressly commanded to seek for it in the next world. So how should there be a taboo about doing a thing that Jesus has commanded us to do? See how confusion enters in. How can it be wrong to do what Jesus has told us to do? So he's told us to seek for treasure in heaven, and he means in heaven, he means in the next life. Now, he's also told us, and the Bible teaches as a principle, that also in this world you'll actually get wealth and riches by being generous. But that's not guaranteed. It's a principle, okay? So you can't guarantee that you'll become wealthy in this life by giving money away. But it is a principle, and it's a very reliable principle, but you cannot truthfully say that it's guaranteed, because you could give all your money away and then be martyred and receive nothing at all. That's perfectly possible, but it's more likely, if you survive, that you'll, in due course, reap what you sow, because the law of sowing and reaping will make sure of that. But that's not guaranteed in this life, but it is guaranteed in the next life. So what you give away, you are guaranteed to get back, multiplied in the next life. And so that's something which there's a kind of stigma about talking about that, because it's considered a bit simplistic, not academic. It's not very academic to talk about that. And it's a little bit perhaps even reminiscent of being worldly. Now there's a contradiction in terms. How can it be worldly to focus on the next life? How can it be worldly to obey Jesus' commands? But the point is, it's seen as being somehow sordid or unworthy or somehow a little bit immature or something. And you hear people saying, well, all I want is, this or that, fill in the blank. They want something or other that sounds spiritual, but it's not what Jesus told them to seek for. What they should say is, all I want is all the things that Jesus told me I should want. I want those things, the things he said to want, do you see? And this is one of them. So we need to not be super spiritual and not be sort of pretentious in an inverted sort of way about this. That's why I go out of my way to be unsophisticated and say that I'm looking for treasure in heaven and money bags in heaven that don't grow old and the moth doesn't consume them and rust doesn't consume them. That's what I want. So whatever form it takes, neither here nor there. I don't mind if it's share certificates. I don't mind if it's a thing I don't even know what it is. It could be something I've never heard of. But whatever it is, I want to have it, you see. And I suggest we should all think that way and consciously seek to store up treasure, not only by giving money away, but in everything we do. Everything we do, we can store up treasure. And it's from 1 Timothy, he says, this is Paul speaking on it. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, thus storing up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is truly life. That's 1 Timothy 6, 17 to 19. Okay, well I've dealt with that briefly because I'm wanting to move on more rapidly today. So criterion number 14. Jesus will judge us on the basis of the depth of our love for and devotion to God. That's a little bit similar to faithfulness. The depth of, D-E-P-T-H, of our love for and devotion to God. How deeply do we love him and are devoted to him? Now he'll measure that. He'll have a way of measuring it because he can see into everyone's heart and mind. And he will measure the degree to which we are devoted to him. And there may be some surprises about this because you might think, well, it's going to be all the extrovert, exuberant people. They're the ones who really love God. They're the ones who are really extrovert and loud and clappy and so forth. They're the ones who love God. Well, many of them do, I'm sure of it. But it's not going to be measured by exuberance or extrovert characteristics and so on, loudness. There are plenty of quiet people who are very devoted and passionate about Jesus. They're just not extrovert, they're not loud, they can maybe be very quiet. So it's going to be measured, but Jesus will measure it. It won't be measured by appearances. And so it's similar to faithfulness, but it's a little different. I call it devotion or being passionate about Jesus Christ. It sounds a bit odd, perhaps for men to talk that way, but we're meant to be. So you're meant to be completely devoted to him. In a similar way, but only multiples of times bigger, to how people were, say, to General Montgomery. He used to meet with the 8th Army. People were devoted to him. Do you see? Well, multiply that by 1,000-fold. That's how we're to be. So men were devoted to Montgomery. Other people were devoted to George Patton. Do you see? Well, that's a little tiny picture of what we mean. We're to be devoted to him and passionate about following him and pleasing him. And so Jesus, speaking in Mark 12, 28 to 31. Do you want to read this out, Chris, on page 78?
And one of the scribes came up and heard them disputing with one another, and seeing that he answered them well, asked him, "Which commandment is the first of all?" Jesus answered, "The first is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbour as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these."
That's right. Mark 12, 28 to 31. But note the operative words in that. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. Do you see? So, loving him is not only an emotional thing. You're to love him with your mind, love him with your strength. Do you see? Love him with all your soul. What's your soul? Your emotions, your will, your mind, all of that, everything. So you're to love him in every sense. So you can love God by reading the Bible. In fact, that's one of the principal ways in which you are meant to love him. So someone might look at a person who reads the Bible a lot and think, well, he's not very loving, he's just a bit studious, but he's not loving towards God. See, the loving people are the ones who are loud and clappy, but this chap over here is just studious. That's not loving God at all. Well, no, on the contrary, that's loving God. Everything is. And whatever God's made you like, that's how the way in which he wants you to love him. So if he's made you a carpenter, then you love God by doing carpentry really well. Or if he's made you into an athlete, you love God by being a great athlete to the best of your ability. Or a musician, or a writer, or a whatever, traffic warden. You love God by doing whatever it is that you are with all your heart and all your soul, and doing the things he wants you to do, obeying him, taking him seriously, caring about him, considering him to be important in every part of your life. That's what he's getting at. So that's what we mean by love for and devotion to. Because every part of us is involved in loving God to the maximum extent. And when Jesus saw genuine, wholehearted devotion in a person, he commented on it. And here's an example of this. If you could read out this, Vicky, from the top of 79.
And while he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at table, a woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard, very costly, and she broke the flask and poured it over his head. There were some who said to themselves indignantly, "Why was the ointment wasted like that? For the ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor." And they scolded her. But Jesus said, "Leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. For you always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them. But you will not always have me. She has done what she could, and she has anointed my body before her the burial. And truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the world, what she has done will be told in memory of her." Mark 14, 3-9.
Yeah. Now that doesn't mean that we're all to go out and get ointment and start doing that. That woman did that because that occurred to her on that day. That was the thing she wanted to do. So that was a specific way that she expressed and manifested her devotion. Others will do it in a different way. It needs to be entirely individual to you. So there's nothing about ointment or perfume that Jesus is bothered about. Jesus isn't the slightest bit bothered about perfume. He was bothered about what that woman did and how devoted she was, because that was worth a lot of money. But note also how the others couldn't see the value in what she was doing. Partly they couldn't understand her, but partly that was because they weren't devoted to him in the same way. And so another person's devotion will always seem silly or strange to a person who's not devoted. But if you aren't devoted yourself, other people's devotion will seem to be somehow foolish or silly, not the right thing, something to turn your nose up at. But that's not the way Jesus sees it. And so we need to be devoted to him in whatever way is right for us. I've personally never given Jesus any perfume at all. I don't expect I ever will. But the point is, in other ways I can express that. Do you see? Okay, number 15. Jesus will judge us on the basis of whether we were overcomers. Were we persistent enough to overcome or conquer the obstacles that we had to face? Very big theme, this, in the Bible. A persistent theme, and one about which the Bible particularly talks about rewards for this. So rewards and overcoming go together regularly. And yet it's rarely ever spoken about. So being an overcomer, I personally can't remember ever hearing anyone talk about it anywhere. Not that I can ever recall. But it's something we're called to be. Something we're meant to do. And it ties in with what I was mentioning last week at Watchorn about the tests we face. The tests are like exams. We're meant to take them. We're meant to overcome. Do you see? And I was speaking last week about how people get confused as if something wrong was happening when they find themselves taking an exam. And so imagine going into an exam and sitting down and someone puts a paper in front of you and you're sort of thinking, what's this person doing? Putting this in front of me. And then you open it up and it's got problems in about calculus and trigonometry and things like this. And you're thinking, what's this? Are they trying to annoy me? Are they just trying to be difficult with me? Why are they doing this to me? You see, now you'd be failing to realise that you're in a test. You're in an exam. So, but that's where many of us are at. We don't know that we're in an exam, and therefore we consider odd or untoward or improper having to face issues as if we should not have to face them. Now that doesn't mean we should go looking for problems. We shouldn't. But where they come looking for us, we're supposed to overcome, and not to consider it strange that we have to overcome. So there are three principal things we have to overcome, and this effectively covers everything, because everything comes within one of these. So we're battling against our own flesh, the world and all it stands for, and the devil and all his demons. So pretty much everything that you ever come across will be either involved in one of those things, or have something to do with one of those things, or be linked to one of those things. Those are our three main battles, and we're supposed to overcome in all three of those battles. And I speak about these in books 7 and 9 in some detail. Those are the three headings. So, we're all called to be overcomers, but we ought to mention what overcoming does not mean, because it perhaps isn't in your mind a confusion, but it is in the mind of some people a confusion, whereby people think that overcoming means overcoming people and becoming in charge, taking over institutions, governments, taking over the world. Now that's the express aim of the Catholic Church, to take over, to run the world. They are less successful in that today than they used to be, but there was a time, and it went on for 1,000 years, where they did effectively run the world. They ran the governments of the world, they ran everything. And they were willing to use violence, to seize power, to take territory, to gain influence. They were willing to use whatever it took to overcome, because they saw that as a positive virtue. But that's not what overcoming is about. It's not about ruling over people. It's not about dominating or manipulating or controlling anyone. Not at all. It's about effectively gaining the victory over these three battles: our flesh, the world, and the devil, and every particular way in which that manifests itself in practice. So we're not called to conquer or rule over other people, but rather we are called to be overcomers of the things we face. And that could be anything. Problems at work, problems and difficulties, challenges, tests of your courage, tests of your endurance, tests of your honesty, you name it. Tests of. So overcoming means passing those tests, passing your GCSEs, and then passing your A-levels, and then passing degree level stuff, and then PhD stuff, and then. Jesus will just keep raising the difficulty. So the trouble with being an overcomer is once you've overcome, more things will be sent for you to overcome. That's just the way it is. So, anyway, I elaborate on this at some length in the book, but I'm going to try and press on because I want to cover some ground. So, let's see. I'm going to press on actually quite rapidly. Yeah, let's move to page 83. Actually, a few verses here. Page 82. Let's read out these verses at the bottom of page 82. So here are some of the rewards that are promised to those who overcome. Okay. Do you want to start with Revelation 2:7, Chris?
Who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes, I will grant to eat of the tree of life which is in the paradise of God.
He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. To him who overcomes, to him I will give some of the hidden manna, and I will give him a white stone and a new name written on the stone, which no one knows but he who receives it. Revelation 2:17.
Only hold fast what you have until I come. The one who conquers and who keeps my works until the end, to him I will give authority over the nations, and he shall rule them with a rod of iron. As when earthen pots are broken in pieces, even as I myself have received power from my Father, and I will give him the morning star. Revelation 2:25-28.
But you have a few people in Sardis who have not soiled their garments, and they will walk with me in white, for they are worthy. He who overcomes will thus be clothed in white garments, and I will not erase his name from the book of life, and I will confess his name before my Father and before his angels. Revelation 3:4-5.
Right, I tell you what, there's several more verses set on page 83, but I'm going to skip those and just give you a summary. This is a recap of what the promises are, because the ones that I haven't read out involve giving us a crown, being made a pillar in the temple of my God. I will grant him to sit with me on my throne. And it says, and Jesus says in Revelation 21, he who overcomes will inherit these things. See? And so there's a whole load of things in the book of Revelation promised to those who overcome. So it's impossible to argue that this is not an important theme. Why does Jesus focus on it so much? Because he could have said something else. He could have said, he who, fill in the blank, does some other thing. He who proves worthy in some other way. To him I'll give these rewards. But he focuses over and over and over and over again on overcoming. But how many of us even see it as an objective or a purpose in our lives to overcome things? Most of us think the only right thing to do with a problem is to avoid it, or to have it over with, or pray for people to get rid of it, or pray for it to go away, or pray for it not to be there in the first place, etc. And that's not to say we should go looking for trouble, absolutely not. But it will come looking for us. We need, however, to alter our view of it, because we know we're facing these things. How do we view these things that we must face? So, to recap, those who are overcomers will receive or be granted the following. So it says, to eat of the tree of life in the paradise of God, a white stone and the hidden manna, authority over the nations, the morning star, hearing Jesus confess their name before God and his angels, to be made a pillar in the temple of God, to sit with Jesus on his throne, to inherit the new heaven, the new earth, and the new Jerusalem. And that's pretty good. That's a fairly comprehensive list of rewards, don't you think? So there's an extraordinary amount available to us if we can learn to be overcomers. Didn't we ought, therefore, to start to think about being overcomers? See how it's not rocket science. One of the things about the Bible, we were speaking last week about how do we read the Bible. Well, one of the things we do is simply to take seriously what it says. Because one of the things we've been trained into is to assume the Bible doesn't mean what it says. Now, that's what's called allegorical thinking. But many of us think allegorically without realizing we do it. And we effectively rob the Bible of its meaning by assuming it doesn't mean what it says. But the vast majority of the time, the Bible means exactly what it says. And even when it's using a metaphor, an analogy, or some figure of speech, it means what the figure of speech means. So if Jesus says it's raining cats and dogs, he doesn't literally mean it's raining cats and dogs, but he does literally mean that it's raining heavily. You see? And we need to stop thinking allegorically without realizing we're doing it and start to take seriously and literally what the Bible says. And if we do that, if you say that from now on, ask God, from now on, please help me to take literally what you say, unless the context plainly indicates that I should not do so. And start reading everything in that way, and you'll be surprised how you'll find things that previously you would have glossed over because it can't possibly mean that. Or, if you hear Jesus say that he's going to let you inherit the new earth and the new heaven and the new Jerusalem, and you might think, oh yeah, fine, that's nice, and pass on. But you're not meant to say, oh, that's nice to you, thank you, that's nice, and then pass on. You're meant to think, hang on a minute, what has he just said? What did he just say? And then dwell upon it and think about it and take it seriously. And that's how we read the Bible. By taking it seriously, it begins to have meaning because we're taking it seriously and literally. Until you do so, the Bible will tend to be incomprehensible. And so that's one reason why some people find it hard to understand, because we're sort of instinctively assuming it doesn't mean what it says. Therefore, it must mean something very hard to understand, and I don't know what that is. Do you see? And that's particularly found when the Bible is speaking about prophecy. But it's also found when Jesus is just talking about plain things. Because these things here are not prophecy, they're just plain statements. There's nothing prophetic about them, there's nothing even complicated about them, they're just plain statements which are not taken seriously. But if we start to take them seriously, it'll have a major bearing upon how we operate today during the exam, because this is the exam. It's a 70-year GCSE exam. You see? It's a long exam. But the whole thing's an exam. Do you see? I got into trouble last week for saying 70 years. Someone told me to raise it to 90 years because they were over 70. So anyway, it's a 90-year exam. Right. So, criterion number 16. Hey, what's this? Criterion 16. Jesus will judge us on the basis of how much courage we displayed. I mentioned this last week, so I'm going over this a little rapidly because I spoke last week at Watchorn and covered some of these issues. But I elaborate on these in this book. But let me give it briefly for the sake of those who weren't there. Courage is really important to God. Most of us don't think of it as an issue that he's bothered about. Most of us would not put it on the list of things that he's interested in. But actually it's up there towards the top of the things he's bothered about. And he will reward courage and rebuke and punish cowardice. Although we never speak about courage, we never talk about it, we never think about it, most of us never hear anything about it. We don't think that we're called to be courageous, that we're supposed to be courageous. We don't think about being under a duty to be courageous. At the most, if any of us think about it at all, we have some admiration for people who are courageous, but we assume that they're just born that way and that's just how they are. And of course we're not, so because I'm not courageous, God doesn't expect me to be courageous because I'm not. And so God fully understands that I'm a cowardly, wimpy weed. He fully approves because that's how he made me. Do you see? Therefore I'm okay. because I don't have to be courageous, because that's not how I am. Now, most of us don't even think anything, but if we think anything, we'll excuse our own cowardice on the basis that that's how that we are. We'll also excuse it on the basis that it's totally sensible self-interest, looking after number one, protecting ourselves is absolutely right and proper. Of course it's right. No right-thinking person would put themselves in harm's way just to do right. Do you see? Now, these are unspoken thoughts. Most of our thoughts are unspoken. Most of our thoughts are unwritten. Most of our thoughts are undefined. We just think them without words. So a person will face a battle or a difficulty or a test or a danger. Without saying any words in their mind, this thought will express itself unconsciously, and it is this. Obviously, I mustn't do anything that puts me in harm's way, and whatever I need to do to get out of trouble, I'll do it. And only a fool would tell the truth if you get into trouble. Only a fool would stand up for Jesus or identify with him if it gets you flack. Only a fool would be faithful to him if it means being unpopular or losing friends or losing your job. So clearly, obviously, I'm not going to do that. And those thoughts just form in the mind, and they direct your actions without even having to need to say any words. And what I'm challenging people to do is to start to consciously think the opposite and to overcome these habitual thought patterns that have become ingrained in us about self-preservation. Not just self-preservation in the sense of keeping alive, self-preservation in terms of keeping your job, keeping your job prospects, keeping your friends, keeping your money, keeping your house, keeping everything. Obviously, we think, well, obviously I've got to keep all that, so I'll just do what I can to the best of my ability as long as it doesn't cost me anything or put me in harm's way. What I'm saying is we should begin to speak different words until they gradually become normal to us. They'll start off being abnormal. And the words we should be saying broadly along these lines. Here I am facing this difficulty. If I do this, it'll please God, but if I do that, it'll please the people I work with. I need to do what pleases God, but if I do what pleases God, it won't please them. And then we say, well, yeah, but be that as it may, I must do what pleases him, not what pleases them. Obviously, ideally, I'd like to please everybody, but I recognize I can't, so I'm going to choose to please him. So in this situation that I now face, the only question I need to ask is, what does God want me to do? And it's not a relevant question to ask, what will happen to me if I do this? It's a relevant question to ask, what does God want me to do? The only relevance of saying, what will happen to me if I do this, is so that you can then face and accept that consequence. And I do that, and I say, what's the worst that can happen to me if I do this? Well, the worst that can happen is they can sack me, or they could take me to a tribunal. So when I was an employee, the worst thing they can do is sack me. All right, well, I'll accept that. As I got older, the worst they can do is take me to a tribunal. The Law Society could come and criticise me. Well, let them do it. Or maybe they could take my house off me, or take my business off me, or maybe they can say that they can just come after my assets. Well, let them do it. And once you say that, you become free, because you've already accepted the worst case scenario. So the worst case scenario is I'll get the sack. Let's make it more relevant to most people. The worst thing, well, they'll sack me. And then you say, okay, well then, I'll accept that. So you say, Lord, I accept the sack. I accept the sack. If that's what I get, so be it. And then you set about doing your very best not to get the sack. But you've already accepted the sack. Do you see? Does that make sense? You've accepted the worst already. So therefore no one can intimidate you. Because you've already accepted what the worst they can do. And what you'll almost invariably find, when you do that, you won't get the sack. But if you do, well, there it is. You've already accepted it. So, that's a little bit of a preamble on courage. But just to prove my point that the Bible considers courage to be important, I've set out a list of verses here on page 84, which we're told again and again to be courageous, be courageous, be courageous, be very courageous, be strong and courageous. This is from Deuteronomy, Joshua, 1 Chronicles. Now think about it. What does it mean? If you're told to be courageous, how can you be courageous if you're not afraid? You see? Now the Bible does tell us not to be afraid, but it means it in a different sense. There are two ways in which the Bible speaks to us about fear. One thing it tells us many times is not to be afraid, and then it's talking about things that you don't need to be afraid of. But when it's talking to you about being courageous, it's talking to you about things you do need to be afraid of, but it's saying, even though you're afraid, do it anyway. So there are some things where we shouldn't be afraid. There are some things where it's reasonable to be afraid, but you should do it anyway. And when that's the case, the Bible says be courageous. Do you see? Because you can't be courageous unless you're afraid. So I can't say, well, I'm tremendously courageous because I can cross the road on my own. I can tie my shoelaces on my own, without help. You see, that's not courageous. It's not courageous unless you're doing something that you're scared of. Do you see? Then you become courageous when you do the thing that you're afraid of. And it's that we're commanded to be. So yes, we are commanded not to fear, but that means things that you ought not to fear, because many of our fears are misguided and unnecessary. Some of our fears are not unreasonable, they're not misguided, they're perfectly right and proper and normal and reasonable. But we're still commanded to be courageous and to overcome them. You see the distinction? So let's look at this verse just to prove a point. From Revelation 21:8, it says, this is about the procession of people that lead into the lake of fire. Now guess who's at the front of the queue of the people going to the lake of fire? It says, but as for the cowardly, the faithless, the detestable, as for murderers, the sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars, their portion will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. Revelation 21:8. Now, how many of us would have put the cowardly in that group? Most of us think the cowardly is the friendly lion from The Wizard of Oz. He's cowardly. Or, we just think it's a perfectly okay thing. Being cowardly is akin almost to being sensible. Risk avoidance, and so on. We don't see cowardliness as a sin. But here it is, placed alongside all these other things. Murder, sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, liars. Why does God place the cowardly in that list? Why doesn't he have them on a subordinate list which is much less serious? Well, the answer is because he thinks they belong in this list, which is more serious. So why doesn't he have the cowardly along with late library books, people who, park 5 minutes too long on a parking place? That's not where he's put them on the list. They're up there at the top. And that's not by accident, it's by design. Because being cowardly will lead you into most of the other things that go wrong in life. If we don't fear the Lord but fear men, we will do the wrong thing. That's why the Bible tells us to fear God and not to fear men. And it also tells us to fear the Lord, because if you fear him, then whatever else you fear will be at the very least, your other fears will be overcome by that fear. In the same way that if you saw a lion running at you from this side of the street and a dog running at you from this side of the street, where would you run? You'd run away from the lion and towards the dog, wouldn't you? It's as simple as that. So if you fear the Lord, so you have the fear of the Lord over here, and then you have the fear of unpopularity over here. Now, if you have the fear of the Lord over here and the fear of unpopularity over here, where would you go if you had both fears? You would go towards the fear of unpopularity and accept it. Or the fear of the Lord over here and the fear of the loss of your job over here. where would you go if you had both fears? You'd say, well, I'm not going to tackle God, I'm going to tackle this. I'm going to accept this fear. I'm afraid of losing my job, but I accept it because it's the lesser fear. Do you see? That's one of the reasons why we're commanded to fear the Lord, because the fear of him will deal with this thing of cowardliness. It'll cause us in 101 different ways to do what's right rather than to do what's expedient, convenient, practical, in our best interests, realistic, and all these other euphemisms for doing the wrong thing. So, many of us as Christians, we operate a kind of self-censorship. We make sure we never say or do anything which might make us become unpopular or lose our job or face a difficulty or put our finances in any danger. We just self-censor and self-limit. So we don't do anything, even if the Bible tells us to do it, if it would have that effect. And again, we don't think it through and put it into express words, because most of the things we do are not put into express words. Do you see? How many people, when they're making a cup of tea, give a running commentary? Do you give a running commentary? I'm going to open the fridge door. I'll take the milk out. I'll put it here. I'll put the kettle, I'll lift it in my right hand. I'll put them. That's not how we work, is it? We just do most of the things we do without any words. And we just self-censor to make sure we never do the things that would put us in harm's way. And therefore, we can very easily, most of us do this, put ourselves into a place where we deny Jesus Christ by just keeping quiet when we should speak. We just keep quiet when we should be speaking. That doesn't mean we should always be speaking, but there are times when we should, and we self-censor by thinking, well, if I speak up for him now, people will laugh at me. Do you see? And therefore we self-censor. When we're with a group that would not appreciate him, well, I can't tell them in front of that group because they would not like me. And so on. And there are many leaders and preachers who regularly deny Jesus Christ, even while teaching and preaching. You think, well, how on earth can they do that? Well, they do, but they deny Jesus Christ by what they don't say and by what they don't teach. Or even by what they do teach, if they choose to make what they say acceptable to people. And the point is that whether what we say is acceptable to people is completely irrelevant. The question is not whether it's acceptable to people, the question is whether it's true. Do you see? And that doesn't mean that we should always go around telling everybody what's true about them. Your hairstyle's a bit bad, or, I don't think much of those shoes. That's not what I mean. But we should say what's true, not what's acceptable. That's not the measure of what we should say. And so many a preacher will tone down what he says in order to be accepted. Or he'll just leave out things, because if I speak about that, people will not like me. So we're not only speaking of ordinary people, we're speaking about those who preach. And they'll leave out all sorts of subjects because they're controversial. Now think about it. Why does a man want to avoid controversy? Why? Because the Bible is full of controversy from beginning to end. It's a walking controversy, isn't it? It's just controversy from page 1 to the last page. So how can you talk about the Bible without being controversial? There's only one way to do it, and that's to edit it and to just focus on what I call the crisps and sweets in the Bible. Just have the crisps and the sweets out of the Bible and just focus on those, but leave meat and broccoli and potatoes and carrots and don't have any of them. Just crisps and sweets out of the Bible, the nice bits. And that's what many a preacher does. Now when we do that, we are denying God. And many a man is going to get to the judgment seat as a pastor, as a church leader, and find that he's not condemned. We need to distinguish the word condemned from criticised. But he'll be criticised because he was unfaithful and he lacked courage. He hadn't got the guts to be a leader and say things that the Bible says. And so it's not only members of churches, it's leaders of churches that need to have courage. And not only in facing martyrdom. 99.9999999% of us won't have to face martyrdom unless things change in this country, which they may. But hitherto, since really the 16th century, hardly anybody's had to face martyrdom in this country. So why do we talk about martyrdom as if that was the issue? That's not the issue. The issue is these other things: unpopularity, criticism, being ridiculed, being laughed at, being thought less of, being excluded, being sacked, not getting promoted. Those are the issues. That's why people often speak about evolution rather than creation. They don't want to be laughed at. So I go out of my way to tell people I believe in creation. And it often gets odd looks. And how did that chap pass his exams? How did that chap get to be a solicitor without having any brains? But I want people to hear me saying something that is rarely said, because it helps others to gain the courage to say it. Because if I'll say it publicly, I believe in creation. What, really? Yeah, I do. Then others might have the courage to say it because they've heard someone else saying it. And that gives you a duty. If you can be the brave one in a group and say something, others who are less brave will think, well, I'll say it then because I heard you saying it. So, I think it's wise actually to ask God to point out any areas in your life, because by definition, given that these things are unconscious and not spelled out, the likelihood is you're not going to be aware of the ways in which you're denying him or being cowardly. So it's a good thing to ask him, to ask Jesus to point out, are there any ways in which I'm denying you or compromising, or that I'm not saying what I should say or not doing what I should do? And help me to have the courage to be faithful to you and to your word, and not to fear men or seek for their approval. Ask Jesus in that way. Ask God. And let me just elaborate on a point I made last week at this other meeting, which caused a little bit of confusion, because I said that I personally, years ago, I made a decision, I made a kind of principle that I will never be influenced by fear. Now, when I've said that to people, I've said it to a few people over the years, they look at me quizzically as if I'm saying that I'll never be afraid, or I'll never have any fear, or I never am afraid. I'm not saying that in the slightest. What I was saying was, this is a decision I made. I will never make any decision, I will never allow fear to have any bearing or influence over any decision I ever make. Do you see? I think this one through, and you'll see that it's helpful. Because you don't know what you're going to have to decide about today or tomorrow. But if you say now, whatever I have to decide about tomorrow, whatever it is, I will not be influenced in my thinking by any fear of anything or anybody at all. Now, that's not the same as saying that you'll never be afraid. So tomorrow, if something happens, you may well be afraid. But if you decide in advance, not at the moment, it's too late at the moment to think it through. In the moment, you'll be trembling and you won't be able to think. But now, ahead of time, you make it a life principle. Whatever I have to face, whatever it is, there'll be factors for and against, pros and cons. I'll listen to the pros that have to do with, does God want it? Would it be right? Is it honest? Is it fair? Is it righteous? Is it what God wants? Does the Bible support it? Am I commanded to do it? Am I commanded not to do it? Those are the issues. But I will not listen to any issues which relate to, will I get into trouble? Will people criticize me? What if I lose my house? What if I lose my job? What if I don't get that promotion? What if the team thinks I'm being stupid? What if my supervisor criticizes me and laughs at me? What if the clients think I'm being ridiculous? Do you see? Now, although you could go on all day thinking of things that you could be afraid of, but they have no bearing on what you do. Do you see? No bearing at all. No proper bearing. And if you say, I will not be influenced by fear, it's tremendously liberating and it's tremendously simplifying. Because then you face an issue, and instead of having to listen to a bunch of issues, you only have to listen to 2 or 3. Is it right? Does God want it? Does my conscience support it? Yes, yes, yes. Well, then that settles it. And then you'll say, yeah, but what about the fact that they might lose your job? Well, first of all, you say, well, I've already decided I'm not listening to that. But secondly, once you get more into this, you'll start to think, well, not only am I not listening to that, but now that I'm hearing you say it, it sounds ridiculous. And I will not listen to it. Let me give you an example. I was once dealing with this woman who had done some bad things at work. She'd actually damaged, it's a long story, but she'd deliberately damaged the boardroom table at the office in order to make it look like someone else had done it and to get them into trouble. Anyway, God guided me, and by a number of different means I realised what she'd done. Because I did a scenes of crime investigation of this thing, and I figured out it cannot possibly have been done by the person that she thinks did it. Moreover, it can only have been done by one person, that was her. Now she had PhD level cunning, but primary school level IQ. So she had the IQ of a 4-year-old, but she had degree level cunning. But she let herself down on that occasion because she tried to get someone into trouble, but she didn't carry out the perfect crime. Anyway, I knew what she'd done, and I tackled her. But I tackled her on that and on some other things too. And in the space of that meeting, this woman turned to me in a meeting and basically threatened me that if I dealt with her, she would tell lies about me. Now that's been said to me by many a person. I've been called everything from a rat to a dog over the years. The point is, here I am in a meeting. Now she tried initially to get out of it by denying things and by, all that kind of palaver, the normal stuff. But when that wasn't working, she tried a full-on attack. So she now threatened me to my face about what she'd do. And in a curious way, that made it so much easier to deal with it. Because until then, I had felt some sympathy for the woman. And I felt, because I hate sacking people, and I don't like confronting people, but I do it because God wants me to. Again, you see, whether you like a thing is neither here nor there. Do you see? It has no bearing on what you do. The question is, are you supposed to do it? So here I was confronting this woman and dealing with this very wicked thing that she'd done to try and get another person into trouble who she saw as a threat. She saw this person as a threat and wanted them out. And she thought I would blame that person. But I didn't. I investigated it thoroughly, and she didn't think I would. She thought I'd just accept the prima facie evidence, and there it is, case settled. Like they always do on Poirot, they've always got the chap, they're always about to hang the fellow, aren't they? And then Poirot turns up, he doesn't accept the initial evidence. That's what she thought would happen. And but the point was, there she was making this direct threat, and I'd felt a little sorry for her up to this point, but it made it so much easier. Now the average person would have quailed at the threat and said, oh well, now I'm faced with a threat. So the evidence suggests that this person's done wrong. Oh, but now I'm faced with a threat. That changes everything. Do you see? No, it doesn't. It changes nothing. The fact that she's making a threat, she could have threatened that she was going to kill me. She could have threatened to, launch a nuclear strike on my town. I'd have said, I'm not going to let that influence me. No way. And so the minute she threatened me, everything became so much simpler. I said, that's fine, you go and do that. You just go ahead, please, don't let me stop you. It's like Winston Churchill said to Hitler, you do your worst and we'll do our best. Just get on with it, do what you're going to do. Do what you're going to do. And so I will do what I'm going to do, and I will not be influenced by what you've just said there. Now had she said other things, now let's imagine she'd said, will you have mercy on me? Because I know I've done wrong, but look, will you sort of help me out of this situation? I could have listened to that, but not a threat. Do you see the point? Now most of us would do the opposite. We would listen to the threat and let that take precedence over every other duty, every other piece of evidence. But if you've decided in advance, I didn't need to think in that interview, what will I do now? I'm being threatened. She's directly saying she's going to tell lies about me. Oh dear. Now, the point is, that kind of thing has been said to me that many times. People have threatened me with all sorts. They're going to go to a tribunal. I say, please go ahead. Just go ahead, do that. Well, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. That's great, you do that. And the point is, firstly, when the person sees that you're totally unmoved, they usually give up on it anyway. But whether they give up on it is neither here nor there. What matters is, what does God want you to do? And what he doesn't want you to do is to be influenced by fear. It has no place in your decision-making process. Does that make sense to everybody? So nobody any longer is thinking that I'm saying that you're never to be afraid. You're perfectly entitled to be afraid. Sorry.
Sometimes we face decisions where we've made a list of pros and cons.
Yeah.
And we honestly haven't known what to do. And we've said, well, this is the list of factors if we do it this way, and this is the list of factors if we do it that way. And then we look at it and think, hang on a minute, that one's a fear, that one's a fear, that one's a fear, that one's a fear. So then we eliminate them, and then suddenly it's quite an imbalanced
That's right.
list.
It's very helpful, yeah. That is something we do. When we've had to make big decisions, that's a very helpful thing. I'll just repeat this into the tape. You're making a big decision. Shall you do this or shall you do that? Write down your pros and cons. Write them down, because a lot of people aren't capable of thinking of 17 things simultaneously and making a decision. The human mind isn't able to do it. So write down the pros, write down the cons, and then look at the lists and then ask yourself, what is the character of the things on each list? So let's imagine the arguments for have to do with all sorts of positive and proper and things that relate to duty, they relate to doing what's right, they relate to everything right. And over here on the right-hand list, there's a bunch of things that are to do with fear. I'm afraid this might happen, I'm afraid that might happen, I'm afraid this might happen, I'm afraid this might happen. Now that, if you look at that list and you think all the things against all have to do with being afraid, all the things for have to do with doing what's right, it seems right, I think it's the right thing for me to do. Well, then you eliminate the fears off your list and the seesaw comes crashing down on this side. But what you'll normally find is the seesaw is leaning to the fear side. There'll be 5 or 6 fears, and once you get them off, the seesaw comes down on this side. Now that doesn't mean you should never take account of any risks or hazards or dangers. Those, yes, but not fear. You see? Okay. Let's try and get 1 or 2 more in. Item 17. Jesus will judge us on the basis of how truthful we were and whether we had the love of the truth. Now this is again something I spoke on at Watch On. So I'm going to summarise this. The love of the truth, this quality, is a character quality, and it means to love and value the truth for itself, for its own sake, in itself. Not for what it brings, not for what it does, not for what it achieves, just for itself, you see. And if you do that, then whenever you face a question about something, is a thing true, you will simply say, is it true? Not, is it convenient? Is it practical? Is it expedient? Will it promote my interests? Will it upset people? Will it make me popular? Will it help my career? Will it do that? All these issues may have relevance to something, but they have no relevance to whether something is true. Do you see? Now that sounds like a statement of the completely obvious, but the average person does not ask himself whether a thing is true. He asks himself a series of other questions which have to do with whether it's all those things: convenient, practical, expedient. Will it be helpful? Will it make me unpopular? And so on and so on. They have nothing to do with whether it's true that this is the case. Equally, they have nothing to do with whether it's untrue. And if we can begin to train ourselves to say, when I'm looking at an issue, I will simply ask, is it true? Or does the Bible say it? Is it true that the Bible says it? But someone might say, yeah, but if you believe that the Bible says that, people are going to criticize you because they'll think this and they'll think that. That's not a relevant issue. The question is, does the Bible say it, or is it true? Not any of those things. And there's an example of this kind of talk in Luke 20, 1-8, where Jesus meets up with a bunch of chief priests and scribes and elders. And they say, "Tell us by what authority you do these things, or who it is that gave you this authority." And Jesus answered, I also will ask you a question. Now tell me, was the baptism of John from heaven or from man? And they discussed it with one another, saying, if we say from heaven, he will say, why did you not believe him? But if we say from man, all the people will stone us to death, for they are convinced that John was a prophet. So they answered that they did not know where it came from. And Jesus said to them, neither will I tell you by what authority I do these things. Now his purpose was to expose the duplicity of these men. Now look at the way they spoke. What have either of those questions got to do with where John's baptism was from? You see, John's baptism was from wherever it was from. And all you have to do is find out where is John's baptism from. Now what people will say or do to you if you hold this view or that view has nothing to do with where John's baptism came from. Do you see? Now these men they wanted to be clever. They didn't want to find the truth. They just wanted to be clever. They wanted to score points. They wanted to score points off Jesus. They didn't want him to score points off them. But it's not about scoring points. Neither is it about being clever. So all they needed to say is, that's a good point. Where do we think John's baptism came from? Let's think about this. What does the Bible say? What has John the Baptist been saying? What's happening at the moment? What's going on? Let's examine it. That's what they should have done. And if they had done so, they'd have concluded, well, actually, we think, our conclusion is John's baptism comes from God, and John is a genuine prophet. Now, if they'd said that, Jesus would have said, that's marvellous, because I sent him along to prepare the way for me. Now you're doing well, you're listening to him, now you can listen to me. But they weren't willing to do that, and they were making these arguments based on if we say this, people will say that, and if we say that, people will say this. But most people think like they did. If I hold that belief, people will do this. If I hold that belief, people will laugh at me. If I say this, people will criticize me. Do you see? So it has an effect not only on our behaviour, but on our doctrine. Even our doctrine is influenced by whether we have the love of the truth. Not just whether we steal from the office, but whether we believe the right things in the Bible. So, basically, truth is one of the things that Jesus will judge. And when the Bible condemns those who are not being truthful, it's not talking about someone else. It's talking about us. It talks about anyone who's not genuinely sincere. And this is one of my favourite passages from John 1, where Jesus meets Nathanael. And he says, behold an Israelite indeed, in whom is no guile. Nathanael was a person who simply believed because things were true and didn't believe if things weren't true. All he was bothered about was what's true. He had no guile in him. He had no ulterior purposes or motives. He had no pretension in him whatsoever. And that's what we're to be like. Then Jesus will judge us for the extent to which we're like Nathanael or like those scribes and Pharisees and so forth. And so, the invitation to us is to say, well, hang on a minute. Before I just assume I'm completely like Nathanael, yes?
Could you explain guile?
Guile. Yeah, what is guile? Guile as distinct from shrewdness. Now, the Bible tells us to be shrewd, but it tells us not to have guile. So to be shrewd means to be aware of other people's guile, to be aware of other people's lies, other people's malice, other people's wickedness, and to be aware of the way other people behave, to be aware of it. To have guile means to do it yourself. So guile means being untruthful, crafty, devious, manipulative, cunning, selfish, self-centered, looking after number one, knowing how to get what you want out of people. and so on. That's guile. And Nathaniel didn't have that. Now, what we're commanded to have is this thing called shrewdness. Shrewdness means identifying guile when you see it in others. Guile means having it yourself. Do you see? So it's like the difference between being able to identify malaria when you see it in someone and having malaria. There's an important distinction. Do you see? Yeah?
Last time you spoke about the Samaritan woman,
Yeah.
and you said that she didn't have guile, but she sinned.
That's right. No, that's right. Ronnie's just said, I spoke at Watchon about the Samaritan woman at the well, and I said she didn't have guile, and Ronnie says, but she was sinful. And you see, the thing is, all of us are sinful. So guile and sin are not the same thing. So guile is a sin, but not every sinner has guile. Do you see? So if a person has guile, they're obviously a sinner. But then so is everybody else who doesn't have guile. So we don't equate guile and sin. They're not the same thing. So guile, the woman at the well, why did I say she doesn't have guile? Because she was completely open, transparent, childlike. She asked Jesus questions. She believed him. She didn't defend herself. She took no offence when he told her what was wrong with her. And she was just completely open to be corrected. Now, if she'd had guile, she'd have been a smart aleck. She'd have tried to deny what he said. She'd have been offended by what he said. And she'd have gone off and told other people that he'd said other things and didn't say that. But she went from that meeting and told everybody, I've just met the man who's the Messiah. I've just met the Messiah. She told everybody about him, and they responded to him. So, what would you think, Ronnie, if someone walked up to you and said, Ronnie, 5 things are wrong with you. Here they are. You're this, you're this, you're this, you're that. Would you be offended, or would you think, how marvellous it is that this person's identified these faults in me? Do you see? Yes, Ray?
Would stubbornness call that?
Stubbornness? No, stubbornness could be an aspect of having guile, but no, it's a different thing. So a person can be stubborn without having guile. It's like you can have a temperature without having malaria. Do you see? It's a thing that a person with guile may well have it, but having stubbornness doesn't mean you've got guile. Guile is about deviousness, cunning, craftiness, knowing how to manipulate other people, knowing how to get what you want without telling the truth about what you're asking for, knowing how to get people to do what you want without being straight with them. Do you see? That's guile. And that we mustn't have. Sorry? Well, most people have got guile. Most people have got a bit of guile. So the only question is, how much guile have people got? A lot of people have got some guile. Some people have got a lot of guile. Well, the reason why Nathaniel was unusual is because he had none. So it was that Jesus was saying that. It was as if Jesus met Nathaniel and he said, behold, an Israelite who's over 7 feet tall with bright ginger hair. That's what he was saying. He was saying, you don't meet many like that. That's what he meant. It was rare. So most people have got some guile. But what we must do is say, I want to get rid of my guile. Now most of us have got guile but not shrewdness. We're supposed to have shrewdness but not guile. So most of us are doing the opposite of what the Bible tells us to do and be. Now then, Stella, 7 minutes past. Do you want me to
Right.
close? Stop? Yeah.
Possibly. I think everything's ready that it's got to be ready.
Is it?
Yes.
Well, shall I stop here then? I'm just about to start another one.
Okay.
Well, that's pathetic. I've got from 13 to 17. I've only done about 5. But there it is. More than last time. But I wasn't very kind raising that, was it? So,
It's been a good lesson. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
right.
I enjoyed it and I understood it.
Does anybody have any queries before I turn the tape off? Anyone? Anything want to raise? No? Okay.